Welcome to the Man Rules Podcast. If you're looking to live with more intention, build connection, and live a more authentic, meaningful life, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Dan Griffin. I don't know about you, but it seems to me that they keep changing the rules for us men without telling us. So each week, I just throw out the rule book and cover the tough topics about the real issues that men face. At the end of the day, I'm not here to tell you what kind of man you're supposed to be. I'm here to help you make your own rules and become the kind of man you want to be. So let's jump in. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Man Rules Podcast. I am here with Mark Greene, who is really doing some wonderful things around men, relationships, relationality, connection. Has been very involved in the Good Men Project. Wrote a book called Remaking Manhood. And we'll just have lots to talk about. But Mark, welcome to the Man Rules Podcast.
Thanks, Dan. It's good to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So just for openings, just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself.
I've been writing primarily as an editor for the Good Men Project for 7 or 8 years now. And over the course of that, I think I sort of began as what a lot of guys sort of fell into once they had a son or a daughter, is I was writing as a stay-at-home dad, as someone who was full-time engaged in raising my son. I mean, I don't really know how you define that in the purest sense of the word, but because I was always home officing, but I was always home. So much of my time was spent with my son. And the other thing I think that started me writing, my wife, Saliha, came into me one day and she said, you write some really great stuff on Facebook, and within 3 days it's gone. In the comment sections and the stuff going on, I started just writing a blog. I started out as mega sad, right? It's meant to be kind of funny, sort of a Godzilla stay-at-home dad metaphor. But pretty quickly thereafter, I submitted some articles to the Good Men Project, and they began to run there. And that was the process by which my writing began to get a lot of comment and feedback. And I don't know if your listeners are that aware of the Good Men Project, but it was originally started by a guy who was an investor in startup companies, and he was a businessman, and he was all these other things. But he was also an alcoholic, and he had gone to enough AA meetings to understand that it was the process of telling our stories that really helps people sort of connect and process their lives and do the sort of work that they need to do. So he started the Good Men Project as a way to help men tell their stories. The site went up on the internet, and I don't know if you've ever heard of the internet, but it's this thing where your best intentions immediately get torn to shreds by binary arguments, crazy internet debates. And so the Good Men Project, when it started out, just became ground zero for these divisive, binary, gendered, crazy battleground arguments. And it took a number of years for that stuff to kind of die down. But in the midst of all of that, the stories were still getting told. And my story started off as being about fatherhood, and then began to be about men and masculinity, and sort of you call them the man rules, but these ideas that sort of define what men are supposed to be and how they impact our lives and how they impact the lives of our children. In that process, I began to look at the question of emotional expression. From where I sit, this thing called the man box or the man rules, and I don't want to speak for your definition of it, but from where I'm sitting, the man box's primary rule about men, about, quote, real men, is that they don't express their emotions. They hide their emotions. They don't show them. They're not, because emotionality has been, for one reason or another, and I think incorrectly so, been gendered as feminine, right? So women do emotions, men don't. And in the process of not expressing our emotions, men and boys, are typically shamed whenever they do show emotion. They shut that process down, and they don't go through the trial and error process over the years to learn how to do it well. And emotionality is key to relationships. It's key to forming relationships that aren't just surface level. So my writing went from being a father to talking and thinking about masculinity, the double standards of it. And now the work is shifting toward what we call relational intelligence, because we believe that emotions and emotionality actually don't emerge inside of us. They emerge in relationship to other people, right? In fact, we even talk about this idea of relational spaces, which when you and I are having a conversation, when we're getting to know each other, when we've known each other for a while, we're growing this shared space between us. And the choices we make minute by minute, turn by turn, conversation by conversation, grow, change, support this relationship, this relational space. And that's where we are today. We've actually just finished a project. We got a grant from Civic Hall Labs here in New York City and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to produce a series of short videos that are meant to like run in their entirety on Twitter and to be shared on Facebook, that talk about these issues of boys and men's emotionality and what we call the culture of male emotional toughness. Wow. How was that? Was that a lot?
Yeah, man, we could just riff off of that. There's so much that you just said that's so critical to, I think, anybody who's really dialing into this podcast and what we're talking about. And so a couple of things. First off, just so everybody's clear about how to find it. When you said we are doing this, do you mean the Good Men Project got this grant funding and you're doing it through them? Or is it through another organization or through your own company?
I have a website called remakingmanhood.com. And when I say we, I mean my wife and partner, Sally Habava. She has a PhD. She teaches couple and family therapy. She also has a clinical practice. So she comes from the school of therapy, which is, there are about 50,000 couple and family therapists. And they're a bit different than some other schools of therapy in that they're really focused on this idea of relationality, of relational spaces. So if you go to a couple and family therapist and you say, I have this emotional problem, they're going to say, well, who are you in relationship with? Oh, I have a wife, I have a family. And say, well, can we have a conversation with that other person too? Or can we bring that family unit in here? Because we want to explore the relationships that you're embedded in, right? So that's my wife, Saliha's background. And she and I together are actually working on a book called The Forever Book. And it not only includes a lot of different ideas about relational thinking and relationships, but it also has just a ton of little games and ideas and methods that you can use to help grow, back to this core interest we have, your children's relational capacities and ability to manage emotions and whatnot. The Good Men Project has been central to how I got to where I am today, and I continue to post articles there and be involved in that community. But remakingmanhood.com is where we're placing a lot of the work that we're doing, and we're beginning to grow that site. And then we also have a page on Facebook, just Facebook/Remaking Manhood. And some interesting things have happened there too. That's actually a good place to sort of see some of the conversations that we're trying to get going. All of our little videos are there as well. I did an animated infographic about a year ago, and it's a 30-second infographic titled The Emotional Suppression of Men. And when I put that thing up, it just went crazy. I don't know, 260,000 views, I think. And it speaks to the fact that we're all sort of scratching our heads about what's going on in our own personal lives. Do we have a sense of connection in the world? Don't we? I don't know if your listeners are aware, but there was a study done by the AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons. They did it in 2010. And what they discovered was that 1 in 3 Americans age 45 and older are chronically lonely. Mm-hmm. Now, this is a diagnosis, right? It's a category of loneliness that's so extreme that these people don't have anyone to have a conversation with about the important issues in their lives.
Mm.
And there's been reams of research done that basically say if you're chronically lonely, that is lonely over a long period of time, it has the same health effect as smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day.
Mm.
So it dramatically increases the likelihood of heart disease, diabetes, obesity, even cancer. Cancer metastasizes faster in lonely people. So if you look at the sort of timeline or the arc of the lives of men and the women who love them, what you see is this culture of male emotional suppression, right? Real men don't show their emotions. Real men are always confident. Real men are providers. Idle men talk and care and get expressive typically only about sports. This whole idea of the man box and how men should do masculinity means that they don't develop these skills to express who they are authentically. Therefore, they don't make authentic connections. They don't form relationships that are lasting. And then you dial forward, and they're age mid-40s and older. They have no relationships, and if they do have them, they get them either through their workplace, maybe through friends of their wives, maybe the PTA dads. But if their kid changes school, all those relationships go away and they get a new set of them. If they change jobs, they find that the people that they hung out with for 5 or 10 years, they're not really connecting anymore. That's over. The long and short of it is, I believe we have what's essentially an epidemic of loneliness, and I believe it grows out of a culture of suppressed emotional expression.
So this has been really powerful information that you're sharing. I love the videos you've been working on. I hope everybody checks out the website. What's been interesting for me is that with the trainings that I do, 99% of the time, when I ask the audience to name the man rules, which is a really critical part of the conversation, 99% of the time, the first one that comes up is don't cry. And that's a big part of what you're talking about. Like, you dig into don't cry, and there's so many more rules that are built into that one rule. But the interesting thing about it is it's so connected to not being emotional, not being vulnerable. These are all those pieces of being a man that are trained out of us. And I think that's part of what you're saying. It's not natural. That's not how we naturally show up in this world, but it's trained out of us over hours and days and weeks and years with all these interactions that we have with people that basically keep us from expressing a more vulnerable self. So if some of the core man rules are about viewing emotions, relationship, connection as really the territory of women and as really a more feminine, quote unquote, experience, how are you finding men engaging with you and wanting to engage and being able to reach men with this really important information?
Right. Well, it's fascinating that you brought up men saying men don't cry. I'm remembering a comments section back and forth thing I had with someone a while back. I don't remember his name, but he came on and after I had done, it was an article about, this issue of being able to develop these relational capacities. And he said, I don't have time to sit around and cry. I don't have time for that. And I think this is a common misnomer that a lot of men have when they first happen upon this conversation, that our goal is that they should open the floodgates emotionally and spend a good 2 or 3 years crying their eyes out.
Mm-hmm.
It's a ghastly idea. It's the last idea I would recommend to anybody, because it places the idea of emotionality as something which is uncontrollable or difficult to experience or difficult to manage. Now, anybody who's done any work on themselves understands that we have issues from our past that may be painful or difficult to to confront or address or work through. But what I tell people all the time is I say, look, when we talk about relational capacities and emotional expression, what we're talking about is something that is empowering. It's extremely powerful stuff. And if you work with kids when they're young and take them through some of the kinds of exercises that we're trying to do, you give them a better set of capacities to deal with the world. And one example I gave this guy when I was talking to him online is I said, look, when you walk into a bar, do you want to go into that bar and have anybody who wants to be able to walk up to you and within 3 or 4 sentences pick your emotion for you? Some guy walks up and he says, nah, 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 and you're angry, right? He's mad. And because he's mad, you mirror his emotion and he picks your emotion in that moment. Or do you want to be able to manage your response to self-regulate emotionally to the degree that you can make a choice? I don't think I'm going to let this guy pick my emotion for me. Now, look, I'm not saying men don't have occasions when they have to front up or get angry or address a wrong or what have you. But it should be a choice. It should not be something that we just get jerked out of us whenever anybody comes along who wants to push those buttons. So for me, this is the point of relational intelligence, is giving our sons the ability to select their responses in the world, to not collapse into the emotions of others, to self-regulate emotionally when they feel a strong emotion coming on, to sort of deconstruct that a little bit and try to understand where that's coming from, to make a lot of other empowered choices around relationships, right? And we have a bunch of stories about how to address the kind of things that can cause us to get irritated or annoyed or frustrated in relationships. If you'd like, I can share one of those now, if it's of interest.
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. What you're talking about is how do we raise our sons in a world where really what I talk about all the time, the rules have changed, quite honestly. There is an expectation for the boys and even men to show up differently. So what you're really doing is laying out the roadmap so that we can do it with some confidence and some competence.
Yeah. And what's fascinating is there's also a perception out there that somehow if you're going to do this work or pursue these kinds of issues, you have to give up what's thought of as traditional masculinity. And again, I have no problem with what's considered traditional masculinity. I grew up in Texas. I grew up with guys who did this sort of a way of performing masculinity. But the problem with the man box specifically is not that a man may choose not to share his emotions, that's his choice, or that he may choose to be more traditional in how he does family and manhood and whatnot. The problem with the man box is when you enforce those rules on other people. And that's where the challenge comes from. Because a lot of boys grow up not just simply being told that it's not good to share your emotions. They are shamed, bullied, attacked for any kind of performance of masculinity that doesn't fit the man box. And in that moment, sharing your emotions isn't just something that that you're politely invited not to do. It's an invitation to get your ass kicked.
That's right.
And so this man box culture didn't take no for an answer in terms of emotional expression. Now we're talking about, okay, so whichever expression of masculinity you want to do, traditional or otherwise, there should be room for all of the different ways of performing this, right? And so the challenge for our sons is how do we give them a chance to sort of learn all these skills, these relational skills that now all of a sudden employers are looking for. And these include being able to accept and understand and work with difference, how to collaborate, how to listen and set aside bias, how to do all the things we need to do to operate in cultures that are more relational and that are more collaborative, right? And this isn't some new age agenda that's suddenly been brought in to business. Businesses are discovering that this is a way to increase profitability, increase creativity, to maintain and keep good employees interested in doing their jobs and staying in the process, this stuff is profitable. It makes money. And subsequently, any of our sons who go into those cultures unable to connect either with people of different cultural backgrounds or different gender or whatever are going to be at a sore disadvantage, right?
It's interesting that you say that too. I mean, there's again, like there's so much that we could talk about as far as this, but I want to touch on a couple of things that you said, because I think in the past, men's work has been relegated to this idea of men crying and men getting naked and going out in the woods and beating drums. And that was really lampooned and satirized once it got out that that's what men were doing, particularly like in the mythopoetic movement. And there was no context explained. There was no real attempt to understand some of what these men were doing. But that also became the definition of men's work.
But this is the thing also. There's nothing wrong with what they were doing.
Absolutely not.
And look what happened to them. They got shamed and laughed at. This is the man box in operation, right? Going out in the woods and beating drums is fine. Do it if that fits for you. The problem we face is that men are vastly different in terms of their internal makeup, in terms of their relational point of view in the world, in terms of what kind of person they are. And if men were free to be who they really are and to be authentic in their expression in the world, we wouldn't see everybody in lockstep doing this 9-to-5 robot walk that men have suffered through for so long, right?
Absolutely.
It's fascinating. So these guys out in the woods, they had a lot of courage to get this process started, but you're exactly right. They were lampooned. And more importantly, men's emotional work was then, oh, well, that must be what it is. Because God forbid we should all be different and have different ways of approaching this and different ways of evolving as people.
And I think there really is. I mean, what I've found in some of the retreats I've done with men and with some of the trainings, just when men begin to touch some of this work, because it has been so suppressed, because the rules have been so prohibitive and so coercive as far as shaming men into not being vulnerable and emotional, there's a genuine fear that they're going to have to get in touch with these softer feelings and that they won't be able to turn them off. I can't tell you how many men that I've worked with where when they felt safe enough, that's been the comment. The comment is, I hold this stuff back because I'm afraid if I let it out, it's never going to stop. So what that man was articulating was as much of a common fear that so many men have, because at some level they know how much has just been stuffed down. It's like the old Fred Flintstone closet, when they used to open it up and then just everything would just pile out on top, including the bowling ball that would hit him on the head.
Yeah. I think that it's safe to say that this way of living that a lot of men have been forced to adopt, and, men are expected to be stoic and providers and confident and all these things. And they're expected, when men start to step away from this, sometimes the first people who tell them to get back in line can be the people they're married to.
Absolutely.
They can be their daughters and sons.
Absolutely.
And so the pressure to maintain this sort of stoic, manly point of view, it's a lifetime we're talking about a lifetime of playing a character instead of being authentic. You're playing a character. You go into the bar and you look at a group of guys and they're all playing the character, and you say to yourself, well, I want to connect, right? I want to be a part of this group because I need connection in my life. And they're all watching a sports game. So you talk about sports. Well, maybe you don't give a damn about sports, but you learn to care about it because it's the thing that you connect around, right? Meanwhile, whoever you are authentically steps to one side and says, no, it's fine. Go ahead, talk about sports. Well, I think what happens to men when they start to do this work is there's a welling up of grief. It's a deep, abiding grief, because what can happen when you start to really connect with who you are authentically is you realize that person has been dead, has been killed off and put away for decades. And you look back over decades of your life and you say, I could have been living. Instead, I was doing this damn game. And this game required of me that I pretend to be someone who I am not. And I will say this also. I think men are diverse enough. There may be 169,258 guys that actually fit exactly that man box way of operating. Maybe there's 582,000. I have no idea, but I guarantee you there's not millions. So you're talking about men, millions of men who in one small way or another don't fit, or maybe in big ways. And we're talking about once you get to men who are gay or men who are trans or whatever those kinds of communities are, believe me, they didn't fit in that box. Right. And many of them got beaten silly for if they gave any hint of being different, right? So we're talking about men who look back on their lives and they're grieving for the fact that they didn't live authentically. Now, the good news is you can start today, right?
Right. That's
you can
exactly
change
right.
this. And I was one of those guys for 35, 40, 45 years. I didn't know who I was, because every time I tried to do this thing that I wanted to do, I got told by someone close to me, what are you doing? Don't do that. We don't have time for that. And subsequently, I have a lot of grief about the opportunities, the relationships, the friendships, the people I simply missed out on, right? I missed out on them because I was hiding the whole damn time.
That's such a powerful statement. I mean, it really is. And I can't imagine men and women not resonating with it. I mean, there's the man rules, there's the woman rules, there's the man box, there's the woman box, there's even the whole box of gender that the transgender conversation is really helping us to see.
Yep.
I talk a lot about conscious masculinity in the work that I do, because, for me, it's exactly what you said. I have no interest in prescribing a certain type of masculinity. I have no interest in criticizing or judging a certain type of masculinity, especially if it's not hurting anyone else. And so it's really about giving people giving themselves the ability to choose and realizing that they have a choice. Because, we live in a world that says that's just how men are. That's just what men do. That's just what men don't do. So can you talk a little bit about that idea? If I hear this conversation, and part of my thinking is, but that's not who I am. You guys are just, that's fine. You guys want to talk about that? That's fine. But that's not who I am. I'm very comfortable with the amount of emotional expression that I have. And I don't need to get into any of that stuff. What would you say? What would you say to those guys?
I would say, you're a lucky man, because those of us who are comfortable with who we are, I think, living more authentic, enjoyable lives. But I would also say, I've heard myself say that, and I'm not doubting a man who says that to me. If he says, hey, I'm happy with the level of connection I have in the world, and let me just be clear. If a guy says I'm happy with my level of emotional expression, that has some meaning to me. But the real question is, do you have enough connection in the world? Mm-hmm. And if you do, if you feel connected and you feel true, and you do not wake up ever at 2:00 in the morning and say, I don't know who I am, then you're a lucky man, and good for you, and grow that in yourself and go down that road that you've set for yourself, and good. But those of us who realized midway through our lives that the game was rigged somehow, and that we had been playing by a set of rules that we didn't even like, and here's the thing. I was at a conversation the other night. I got invited to this masculinity discussion, right? And one of the people in the discussion, actually, let me preface that. Someone said to me recently, some people are born to be soldiers. They're born to fight for our country. That's who they are.
Mm-hmm.
And I absolutely agree. But people are born to be all sorts of things, right? So I'm at this conversation, and there's a woman there, and she teaches political science at West Point, and she's she's an Apache helicopter pilot who did time in Afghanistan, right?
Wow.
And this is a woman, right, who's basically a pretty solid version of a man.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and it was fascinating talking to her. And she talked about the kinds of issues she had to confront in order to fly an attack helicopter in combat, right? So we are diverse animals. We are born different from each other. The problem isn't that some men are born to be warriors. The problem is that all men are not.
Mm-hmm.
And so find what comes naturally to you, but for God's sake, let the guy next to you find his own way. Don't pick it for him too, because you're so unsure of your own identity that you have to force it on everyone else in order to feel comfortable. Because that's if a guy says to me, I'm happy with my level of emotional expression, and he's okay with the gay pride parade, I believe him. If he's not okay with the gay pride parade, then I got questions for him,
Well, for sure. And I think it's exactly what you said. I mean, I think I feel the same. I want to give men and women whatever right they want to their experience. But I also know that for men, part of our training is to reject any potential sense of vulnerability a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Except, and this is where I've noticed it the most, and you started this conversation talking about this, so I want to spend a little bit.
I know what you're going to say.
A little bit of time on this, but except as fathers.
Right.
Except as fathers. Now, what's interesting is I'm in recovery too, and my work really came out of my being in recovery because I saw how there was a completely different box in recovery for men. Something had changed dramatically for men, but I didn't realize or know how many people saw it. And so that's kind of a separate piece. But what was interesting is in the recovery culture, we have a saying, you cannot transmit something you don't have. And it's a powerful statement that I pay a lot of attention to. I'm writing a book for fathers, and I'm really trying to figure out the best way to communicate some of these core ideas. But one of them is like, how do you teach your child to be emotionally open, to be vulnerable, especially your son? Let's talk about sons. But I mean, I've found this with my daughter as well. Mm-hmm. When you're in your past, your experience is being shamed and not being allowed to be vulnerable. And then you talk about the trauma that's connected to that for a lot of us because of physical abuse, emotional, verbal, sexual abuse, and how that shows up for us as fathers. I see so many fathers who really want to have that space and be that safe space for their kids. But a lot of the times the struggle is so significant because nobody showed them how to do that.
Yeah.
So
I would say to you that for me, my son taught me how to do that, because in the moment that I was holding him, when he was born, I spent 6 months just flipping out. I was like, oh, sweet God in heaven, I'm going to drop him. I'm on his head. It was a learned process. But as I learned him, he learned me.
Mm-hmm.
And there came a moment when he was maybe a year old. And I remember this to this day. I had a house with wood floors, and it had a dining room connected to a living room connected to a kitchen that you could go door to door in circles. So I was walking in circles. It was dusk. He was getting sleepy, and I was holding him and walking, and I was humming to him, and he settled against me. And I remember the creaking of the wood floor with each step, and just the sense of absolute peace that I had found I had found a definition of myself that was so authentically empowered and so real for me that I didn't have to wonder who I was anymore. I knew this child thought well enough of me to trust me to sleep against me, and that meant something, right? I had earned that over a year of trying to learn to be a father to an infant, and that changed me, and it changes a lot of men. That said, yeah, it's a scary process to try to figure out what you're missing and what you will transmit to your children of your own ghosts and fears. But I will say this, they're incredibly resilient creatures. And if you let yourself love them, some of that other stuff will come along. But it is indeed, we have to be mindful of all of that. I agree with you.
Well, I love to say, because this has been my experience with a daughter. I mean, I love what you said. I mean, I don't even know if I'd say I spent the first 6 months freaking out. I would say I'm still, now that she's almost 8, it's a new kind of freaking out. Now it's freaking out about this. And it's, I mean, but it's almost getting comfortable with not knowing, which is a huge man role, right? You got to know everything. You got to fix everything, and add that to the emotional suppression. It really is a great treat.
Holding uncertainty is an art form.
Yes, it is, right? And so, like with my daughter, what you said is so beautiful, because I really do see her as the best teacher for me. I've just recently, in the last, here's I'll tell on myself. I've talked about this for like 3 years, about how important it is, because I'm so tall compared to my daughter, and I'm so loud and intense, that just getting on my knees and talking a little quieter, especially anytime there's some potential conflict or disagreement, has just been so critical to her feeling safe and having a sense of me as a man. So I've really started taking that seriously and doing that, and I've just noticed a shift with her. Now, my father didn't do that. I didn't get that. And so it really goes to what you're saying. Like, if we can stop enough to really pay attention to what our kids need, then we can give that to them. And I'm working on a book. My listeners know about this, but it's called What Men Would Tell You If They Weren't Too Busy Watching TV. And I'm writing it with a good friend of mine, Alan Berger, and we're writing it for women. And one of the pieces that we talk about all the time is with fathers, a lot of the times being a father is giving everything you never got. And in doing so, you actually get it. And that's been such a powerful experience. And I think that's part of what you're saying. Like, let your son teach you, let your daughter, let your child teach you how to give what they need and what you probably needed.
Yeah. Well, one thing that Sally House said to me a long time ago, she said, you better learn to love the questions, because the answers aren't coming yet. And another thing that we talk about a lot, I had mentioned earlier, there was a little method or mechanism, a way to look at relationships. And I'm going to go ahead and share that now. And it's called listening with curiosity. And basically, it's one of the things we talk about in our book, but it works like this. When we're in a conversation with our spouse or our kid or whatever, and especially somebody, we've known for years, we have all these stories that we create, and we file them away, and we say, yeah, my wife believes this and this and this, or my kid believes X, Y, and Z. So when we start to have a conversation about something, and I'm going to take the example of my spouse, she says something, and I go to the story, and I say, oh, I know where she's going with this. I know exactly what she's about to say. Or, she may say something a little vague about something that I did, and I'm like, oh, I know what she didn't like about that. It's these stories we file away about people, and they begin to dictate which part of the conversation we choose to focus on, which thread in the conversation we consider to be the one we're going to tug on. And instead, if we walk up to our wife or our child or our business partner or anybody, and we intentionally take on the mindset that we're about to be surprised by what they tell us. We're about to learn something new. We're about to have a different kind of conversation that isn't based on what we think we know, but instead what this person is really trying to communicate. It sets the stage for a different kind of conversation. And every time you talk to someone, they say 6 or 8 things, and those are all potential threads. And hidden in there are offers, for instance. And if we choose to ignore the offers and don't pay attention to the threads that might be, that create some curiosity or might lead somewhere new, but instead we just recommit to the same story we have about where they're going and what they think, then we do ourselves a vast disservice, right? Because people are constantly changing and they're constantly looking for ways to create energy in relationships. And if everybody makes the choice instead to listen with curiosity and be like, oh yeah, what did you ask more questions? What did you mean by that? And tell me more about that. And if they do say something vague that you think is referencing to the fact that you slammed the kid's hand in the car door 5 years ago, ask, is that what you're talking about? Is that the thing you're referring to? Things that may be sources of pain for us and for our family that haunt us, that we keep skipping to when there's some vague conversation going on. Ask, find out. Are we talking about something that was really catastrophic in the past, or are we not? It's not even about that. So this process of listening with curiosity can really transform a conversation. And when even if someone says, I don't want to do X, and if you say, okay, why? What's that about? And they say, well, I can do Y. Well, that I can do Y is an offer. And if you don't acknowledge that they're attempting in the moment of expressing some difficulty to offer an alternative, if you don't see that as a gift, then you're missing out on what can be built in any conversation about any subject at any moment. So this idea that we can be surprised by people we've known for a long time, it's just a mindset, right? It's looking for the signs of that because they're all there.
The way I've decided to end all my podcasts is I find that there's always so much great conversation, and people sometimes even take notes, with podcasts and are trying to track. I always ask my guests to try to, whether it's distilling from what we talked about or if it's just some 3 key takeaways that they want our listeners to leave with. And so you anticipated it. You talked about the first one. And so let's say the first one is really listening with curiosity. And I think it was a wonderful explanation of how to do that. You got 2 more for our listeners about some takeaways, some elements that they can put into their lives right now as they begin to think about how to connect more openly and relationally.
Sure. I would say this, especially to men who, if any man listening to this feels like he doesn't have as many friendships as he wants, I would say that friendship building is also about being intentional about it. Calling people up, saying, look, if there's people that are local, say, look, every Wednesday night we're going to get together. It's going to be the guys are going to get together. We're going to play a little poker game. We're going to get something regular going. The problem with a lot of men is we let family obligations, work obligations, get the kids to softball practice, all these other things. We put those first. And by the end of the week, we haven't spent any time with anybody that is just about us and about our friendships, right? And additionally, if there's people that you knew 20 years ago who you can sit right now and see their faces and you love them, don't just call them. Get on a damn plane and go see them. Because this is how we keep these lifelong relationships alive. Again, stop letting your other responsibilities always get in the way. Find some time for yourself and for the men that you love in your life. And then if I was going to come up with a third suggestion about all of this relational work and relational stuff, I would say that, if you can do it, take a second and come to remakingmanhood.com and look at the 5 videos we got a grant to produce. They're 2 or 3 minutes long, each one. And I think you'll get a sense of the arc of both the risks and the ways that we can begin to change this generationally with our kids and in the world. And once you get a sense of that arc, I think it may help you sort of decide for yourself what makes sense for you to do next, either for your families, for your brothers and sisters, kids, wherever you are in the world.
we've got listening with curiosity. We've got something that a lot of men have been told is not only not something to do, but to not give themselves. And that is to take the time to foster relationships that are outside of their role as provider and their role as parent, that really speak to what they need and what really feeds or builds their spirit and their sense of self. And then third is going to remakingmanhood.com and really seeing some of the elements there. Spoken like a true...
Like a marketing guy.
Like a true marketing guy. It's like, yes, you want to learn more? Come to the website. And what I will say is it's a great website. The videos are great. Like you said, they're simple, they're visual, and they provide a great visual for what so many men experience but don't necessarily know how to put into words. So men or women or, whoever, visit the website, check out Mark's stuff. His information will be on our website with this podcast. Mark, any final thoughts or comments before we say goodbye?
I just want to say these conversations give me hope that I'm going to have a good life. And that's something that means more to me than I can say. I'm still working on this, and it is by no means guaranteed that I've cracked the code. But these kinds of conversations make me feel like, it's good to be a man, and it's good to be a man who's trying to find out who he really is.
That's awesome. I really appreciate it. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank our listeners for another great episode of the Man Rules podcast. And remember that you can learn more as well at themanrules.com and check out some of the other materials and information that we have. Thanks again, Mark. Have a wonderful rest of your week. And for our listeners, make it a great day. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Man Rules podcast, where we don't let the rules rule us. If you have ideas for guests, topics, or even want to be a guest, send us an email at ideas@themanrules.com. And check out our website and everything we're up to at themanrules.com. The only question we have to ask is what kind of man you want to be and what's keeping you from being that man.